Hi, I hope you're all on and hear me well. Welcome to the Kidney Project's live Q&A. Today I have with me Dr. William Fizel, my colleague and clinical partner, and we'll be happy to take your questions throughout the rest of the hour. To start off with, I'll turn over the microphone to Dr. Fizel and have him explain to you a little bit about why we undertook this project on developing an implantable artificial kidney.
Hi, good afternoon and welcome. We started this project about 10 or 11 years ago when we really focused on the growing difference in survival between patients who received a renal transplant and patients who continued to be treated with hemodialysis. And when you take a step back and you think about it, 9 or 12 hours a week of therapy is very, very little therapy compared to what your kidneys do all day long. I think any of us who have kidney trouble, our first thought is, can we get a transplant? Because transplant is so beneficial. You're not tied down to a dialysis unit. You're not getting stuck with needles all day long. And you live longer. But as you all know, transplant is limited by the supply of donor organs. There's 100,000 people on the wait list, and there's less than 20,000 transplants a year. What could we possibly do to expand or augment that supply of donor organs? Well, kidney dialysis is the first long-term technical replacement for a failed organ, and there's a way in which the technology that's been used for dialysis really has been kind of stagnant for 30 or 40 years. We're using the same hollow fiber technology, the same blood pumps, the same concepts that were used when I was a child. Can we take some of the new technologies that have been developed in the last half century and use them to try to devise a therapy for patients that can be completely implantable, that can be continuous, that can function around the clock, that can work without any need for ongoing fiddling, so that patients can be free to live their lives? And it didn't take long after talking with Dr. Roy to understand that while the field of dialysis has been focused on optimizing the use of the tools that are already there, there's a whole world of new tools out there, whether they be new materials, new engineering technologies, new cell therapies, new ways of growing cells, that we can use to devise an implantable artificial kidney to replace dialysis and augment the supply of donor organs for patients who desperately need an alternative to go into a dialysis center and riding kind of this roller coaster effect of toxins building up slowly over a couple days, then in an hour they get removed and they build up again. That's not the way people would choose to live their lives if they had the option of doing something better. So let's do something better.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. So what we'll do is start taking questions, and if you are able to, you can text your questions on the side, and we'll be able to answer them as we go forward. So the first question we'll answer is, what's the status of the animal studies? So to start off with, the project basically started from concept. We took an idea that we have to do something different. Clearly, dialysis itself was not enough, and there are not enough organs for transplant. So we started actually with a sketch, and then we developed increasingly complex prototypes, and today we have began to test the prototypes in animals. So how far are we? We have started a series of studies where we're taking devices into different animal models, pigs, canines, and testing out the blood compatibility, testing out the viability of the cells, both on the bench and has to be in the device. But we feel that through this stepwise approach, we will learn with every iteration, take that data refine the design, build up a set of data that we can take to the FDA so we can get approval for the first human device. So in short, the status is we're in animal studies. It's a journey, and the journey is limited by a couple of things. One is the results. Animal studies take time, and you have to do a lot of planning for that. Second, it does take resources, money being one, as well as skilled personnel. Luckily, we have the latter in plentiful supply. The money comes a little slower. Do you want to add anything, Bill?
No, I think that captures it very well. I think all of us who are eager to see a better option are frustrated by the slow pace that we perceive happening. I know I am, but we're making very real progress that in a very few short years, really thanks to Dr. Roy's leadership, we've been able to move from a concept just sketched out on a piece of paper, hey, what if we did this, to the fact that we now have physical devices that are under test in a preclinical environment to prepare for an FDA submission. I think that's a huge stretch. For 50 years, the underlying technology of dialysis has been stagnant, and now in the 8 years since we first got our first couple nickels of funding, we've moved from just a pie-in-the-sky concept that seemed so ambitious that many people wouldn't even really talk to us about it, to the fact that we now have surgeons prepping an animal and implanting a device and measuring function. I think that's a huge leap in a short period of time.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing. So there's a certain element of engineering that we're doing. The concept of filtration with cell therapy was demonstrated in a large-scale system, as some of you may have seen on our websites, by our colleague, Dr. David Humes at the University of Michigan. So those experiments, which are done with a large system using extracorporeal components available in the ICU, established for us and for the community that this approach of combining ultrafiltration with cell therapy is not only possible but provides a healthy benefit or health benefit. So the question then comes, how do you miniaturize it? And the job or the work we have undertaken over the past few years is to miniaturize. So it's fundamentally a challenge to engineer something that's small, reliable, and will perform for a long time without interruption. Next question. So I'll pick the next question. Is the FDA helping you at all? So the FDA is definitely a great partner, and what we are doing at the FDA is actually very exciting. A couple of years ago, the FDA put out a call, which was, do you have any opportunity to develop new technologies for treatment of kidney failure? And they put this out to the community as a competition. We submitted our idea for the implantable artificial kidney, and we are lucky to be selected as one of 3. So what they did with us was they actually sat down with us and understood what we were trying to do. We understood what their constraints were. They do not want to sacrifice patient safety, and they should not. And they wanted to understand from us what was the technology path. And then I guess we had a dialogue. How can we make this go in the most efficient way possible? A key barrier for a lot of people, a lot of developers and industry, has been the FDA puts up a lot of regulatory obstacles that impede progress as is perceived. Instead here, we told them what the challenges were. They told us what the constraints are from their side, and together we've laid out the series of milestones that we have to meet so that we can get approved in a timely manner. I'll have Bill talk a little bit about some of the milestones that have to be addressed.
So I want to reiterate what Dr. Roy said. I think it's very common to hear the FDA portrayed in a caricature of regulatory zeal and bureaucratic burden. And at least in our experience with them, they have been committed, flexible, creative, and they actually have shortened our development timeline by a couple of years by engaging with us early and helping us map out a framework for device examination and testing and eventual approval. With the same degree of rigor and the same commitment to patient safety, they've allowed us to cut a couple $1 million off of our development budget and at least a year and maybe longer off of our testing pipeline. So our experience with the Food and Drug Administration has been an unmitigated plus, I think. And I have only the highest praise for the folks at the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health who had the vision to say, we understand the technology has stagnated. We understand there's a pressing need to change the platforms that are used to treat patients. So let's invest our time and our effort and our personnel in engaging with early stage companies in a way that we've never done before. So I think that's phenomenal. And again, they started with the end in sight. They said, who are you going to test this in? Who are we going to be thinking about as your first patients? Who are you thinking about as the patients that you're going to choose, that you're going to think are going to benefit from this device? And let's work backwards from that goal rather than hitting you with a long list of in vitro bench testing goals, preclinical goals that may have no relevance to what you're actually trying to do. So without sacrificing any commitment to safety, they speeded us on our way rather than forming a barrier to our progress. So again, I only have the highest praise for them, and I think it's probably a mistaken notion to portray them as a barrier to progress.
Okay. Terrific. So one of the things that in this discussion that has come up with the FDA is when can we actually get started with getting humans? So then we work ourselves backwards. So, and I know many of you have asked this question as well, when will you start testing this in humans? Obviously, a key component for us, or key mission of the FDA, and it also is our mission, is that we do no harm. And it's important to show that the device is safe. And you do this through a series of studies. A series of studies that will have to be done in humans, but also prior to that, done in animals and done on the bench top. And the first step in all our device testing is to show that blood would flow through the device and would not cause clots that can cause problems downstream. So having put that as our key threshold, that you should avoid blood clot problems, the first task the FDA and we have identified is that the device should perform blood filtration without clotting. And this is such an important task that we have been advised, and we agree, that we should test just the filter over a long period of time. And what this means is it should be tested obviously in animals, but no animal is representative of a human as a human is. So we'll do this in an animal, but ultimately in a human being that is qualified to be in the first clinical trial. And this first test would be testing the implanted filter and its ability to perform filtration. And I'll let Bill talk a little bit about what the value of that device is and how and what would learn from it that would advance the overall project.
Great, thanks, Shiva. So, Dr. Roy is exactly correct. When we take care of a patient, whether it be a patient in the dialysis unit whether it be a patient in the hospital or when we consider how we're going to test our device, we don't want to hurt anybody. That's kind of the obvious thing to say. Dialysis patients, as you know, if you're a dialysis patient, you know, are very prone to clotting disorders, even though they get a lot of heparin and anticoagulants as part of their treatment. So we've thought long and hard about the technical aspects of how we get blood flow to the device, how we push blood through the device, powered only by the heart's pressure, no rotary blood pumps, no things to plug into a wall, and how we think about the surface chemistry of the membranes and how we improve the biocompatibility of the device. So, because that's really the nature of our first big innovation, was the new membrane technology that Dr. Roy brought to the project. So we need to make sure that that works and works safely. Now, if we get to the point where we can put a filter into a human patient as safely and easily as we're able to do it with experimental animals now, that in itself is extremely interesting, because we could conceivably perform hemodiafiltration in a patient at home. We could lower the barriers to self-care of a patient at home. We're not talking about dialysis. We're talking about a new therapy where a patient's blood is filtered by the device, waste products are disposed of, and a clean replacement fluid is infused. Many patients who start dialysis choose peritoneal dialysis as their modality of choice because it allows them to retain the quality of their life. They're able to do the dialysis according to their own schedule in the privacy of their own home. They're able to adapt the therapy according to their own needs in response to their own assessment of their health. And that's a degree of freedom that patients prize. And we'd like to see if there's a way to get the perceived benefits of self-care hemodialysis at home, which very few people do, with the ease and convenience, flexibility, safety, and confidence of peritoneal dialysis. So our work with the Food and Drug Administration to create an implanted filter is a huge step along the path to our goal of a completely implanted artificial kidney. But the FDA and us together have been very focused on the idea that testing this novel filter that our engineers have developed is not only a step towards the eventual goal, but it might also be useful as a therapeutic device in and of itself.
Thank you, Bill. So one of the questions that I see here is, has the blood clot issue been resolved? And once this is ready, are there medications that the patients will need to take? Let me address the first part, and then I'll hand over to my colleague, the physician, to handle the second part. So I guess the question is, you know, what does resolve, how do we answer the word resolved? So yes, we can show in the lab that we have coatings and we've got a design of our device that does not clot for the short-term studies that we've done to date in the animal. And we feel confident if we can take these studies and extend them in the animal with some probably iteration and design iteration, they would perform as we expect. But there's no way to answer the question and say it's resolved without doing the study at two levels. One, to do the study for a much longer time in a set of animals. One animal is not enough. Okay, and show that there are no problems over a long period of time. Now, the question is, what types of animals? There's really no animal that's like a human, but there's some animals that people have used in the development of, say, blood contacting devices like artificial hearts and stents, where animals have been used, such as pigs. And that's one place we can start. But ultimately, to know if we have a manageable strategy, we'll have to show this in the first clinical trial. So I want to answer the question by saying, yes, we think we have it handled on the blood clot issue, as you put it, but we have not done all the studies that will be necessary to tell the FDA, please give us approval to take this into a human being just yet?
So many patients who are on dialysis end up needing some form of anticoagulation. Either to get through the dialysis session, they get some heparin so the blood doesn't clot in the dialyzer. Some patients have heart valves or heart arrhythmias that require them to take warfarin, also known as rat poison, to thin their blood and prevent their blood from clotting. Our goal is no anticoagulation. Our goal is that no patient need to take any pill or injection or other agent to impair the normal clotting of their blood, because you need your blood to clot to keep you safe, full stop. That said, there's patients who will need anticoagulation for other reasons, and that may allow longer lifetime of the device compared to patients who aren't on any anticoagulants. There may be patients who are prone to clotting either for genetic reasons or because of some other disease that they have, or to get the benefit of an artificial device like our implantable artificial kidney, they will need to take some anticoagulant. So time will tell, and the relationship between the tests that we do in experimental animals now, in a variety of species of experimental animals now, because when Dr. Roy said one animal is not enough, he doesn't mean one pig. It means one species of animal isn't enough to really give us confidence that when we use this device in human subjects, that those human subjects will be safe. Because this is different than the other blood contacting devices out there. When people consider, for example, the artificial heart program is probably the other large technology effort in organ replacement right now. Those patients don't have any plan B. If they don't get an artificial heart, they die in a few months of heart failure. We have to meet a different safety threshold, because any patient who's potentially a candidate for our device also has the option of pursuing dialysis. So we have a more stringent safety threshold, I think, than the other organ replacement technology projects that are out there. So time will tell. Our goal, no anticoagulation.
Thank you. What I'll do is I'll actually mention your names as so that you know who asked that question. So that was courtesy of Irene, and Irene, we've known Irene in the past. So great question, Irene. Bill, another question that has come in from Stephanie is: kidney disease usually drives up your blood pressure, and blood pressure contributes to the degradation of the kidneys. To what extent would our device affect this cycle?
Great. I'm actually going to try to answer that question, and also another question from another listener about chronic kidney disease and kidney stones, because they both cover some of the same territory. We have so far thought about this implantable artificial kidney as a therapy for end-stage renal disease. So when you've gotten to the point that your kidneys have failed and that you can't get rid of waste products anymore, and you're starting to get kind of sleepy and stupid from buildup of the waste products, or you can't get rid of salt and water and you're starting to get puffy ankles and you're starting to drown, the usual triggers for somebody to initiate dialysis or to pull the trigger on a preemptive transplant, that's the target audience, as it were, for our device. The two questions, one from Stephanie, and I apologize, I didn't catch the name of the other person who asked, who's asking about kidney stones, is there a way in which your therapeutic device could be used prior to the onset of kidney failure itself to ameliorate the problems that affect patients with chronic kidney disease and drive them from safe, stable chronic kidney disease, yeah, the lab values are funny, but I still feel well, down that road to end-stage renal disease? That's a great question. We know from epidemiology that once patients reach a certain level of kidney insufficiency, almost all of them progress to dialysis-dependent renal failure, no matter what pills we doctors shove at the patient. We can slow it down a little bit, we can make it a little bit more tolerable, but once you get to a certain point, you're on that train track that leads you to end-stage renal disease. Is there a way that our device, used prior to end-stage renal disease, could slow down disease progression? For example, by getting rid of the solutes that form kidney stones. For example, by being able to dump salt water out of the patient's body, reduce the blood pressure crises that occupy patients with chronic kidney disease, and kind of get them the best of both worlds, which is saving the kidneys that they have. I would love to be able to answer that question. I think that's a fantastic idea. It's something that we've considered, but the risk-benefit ratio is important. The idea of undergoing a major surgery to have an artificial device, which is, regardless of how good you are as a patient, is going to be susceptible to infection because it's a foreign body in the patient. There's a risk to all of this, and understanding where that risk-benefit ratio is critical for our choice of an initial patient population in which to test the device. I love the idea of being able to intervene with a gadget like a pacemaker and be able to go to a patient with CKD and say, guess what? I've got this device. I can sew it into you and save your kidney. But I'm not sure that that's the first step that we want to make. If you think about a patient with end-stage renal disease who's on dialysis, they have 16 to 20% per year mortality if they make it past the first 90 days of dialysis. As many of you know who are on dialysis or who've had a transplant, I see a question from somebody with Alport's disease who's had a transplant in the past. You're up against a very morbid and potentially fatal disease. And so the safety criteria, the risk-benefit ratio of yet another day on dialysis versus some alternative is very different than the risk-benefit ratio in patients who are not yet in renal failure. So I think it's a great idea. I would love to be able to explore that. I think we need to have a lot more confidence about the long-term safety of a device before we start thinking about whether it could confer some benefit to patients who don't have kidney failure yet.
So we're going to maybe shift a little bit from some of the questions on the clinical side to maybe some of the questions I'm seeing that are maybe related to the business side and money side. So let me take the question from Rosemary Dixon. So the question is, you know, she knows from some of the Q&A, I think on Facebook, that $250,000 is needed to move the research forward. Do we have people working on this, and to what extent is the university funding the project? So let me step through that in one sort of broad way, and then we'll go into the specifics. So a project of the magnitude of an implantable artificial kidney requires money to do research and development, a lot of the development, and then ultimately there's also the money to the commercialization that's beyond the technical development. We have estimated that the full artificial kidney, from where it was from a few years back through the first set of clinical trials, okay, would take about US dollars, about $18 to $20 million. Now, that is on the technical and scientific development side, and that would get through the first set of human patients. Now, when you take that number and break it down, and we've been fortunate with working with Bill and others, we've raised over $7.5 million through mostly grants and some philanthropy to make that number. Instead of 21 million, we need still another 13 million. Again, that's the big goal. The number that I think that you're referring to is sort of the next set of studies we need to continue to wrap up so we can take the data to the FDA just for the implanted filter. So this will obviously move the research forward, and we are raising this through a combination of grants and philanthropy. Some of you, like Irene, have participated in that in the past. And as we get that money, we advance the device development and the animal testing. Do we have grant workers working on this? Absolutely. I mean, that's probably one place where Bill and I spend more time than we would like to, because we'd like to be in the lab, but we do that. And to the extent that UCSF and Vanderbilt and a few others are helping, can't be understated. So obviously, this is a project, and we have to get resources within the university that other people might also need. So we do have to ask for those resources, whether it's lab facilities, whether it's time in the OR, whether it's clean room facilities for making the membrane. So the universities have ponied up in the last couple of years more than $500,000. I'm taking into account both personnel and supplies. Now, is that enough? Absolutely very helpful, but it's not enough. We need to continue to raise the money so that we can do these animal studies and ultimately move it to the first in man. And it's a process. And this process is where grants come in, philanthropy comes in, and some of you who have advocated for us and have supported us, that's why you've come in. So we are very appreciative of that. I'm going to move to the question that was brought up by Sue Real. And again, it's another money question. If money was no issue, when would the kidney be available to the public? If money was not an issue, the total development plan we have would basically is designed so that it would get to the first human being sometime towards the end of 2017. Now, are there problems that could crop up? Yeah, possibly, absolutely. That always happens in research. Are we optimistic that we can meet the target if the money was available? Absolutely as well. Now, we do have to take into account that there is a lot of body of scientific work that's already there, and we are standing in some ways on the shoulders of giants who have done a lot of the basic science, and we are taking the engineering approach. So there's always iterations that have to be performed, but we feel we can get there within 2017. If we did not have the money, does that change the timeline? Absolutely. And I think the question is, you've also asked is if the project solely reliant on NIH grants, or is there a crowdfunding source? So we, as Dr. Fizel and myself, we are able to ask the NIH, and we've had some success from both the National Institute of Bioengineering and the and the Kidney Disease Institute for getting some funding. But that only funds mostly the basic part of the research. There's still technology development, and for that we have to look outside. And I know through my Facebook posts and some of the other discussions I've had over the phone and in emails, if there is ways you guys are able to participate through a crowdsource funding or hosting your own fundraisers, that helps. We do not have a formal crowdsource. As the university, we have some restrictions on doing that. But I know some of our friends, some of who you are online now, have done that. So that actually is very helpful to us. I'm going to have Bill talk to you a little bit about why there's actually a money issue for kidney disease research, and why kidney disease has not traditionally attracted the same level of interest from the government as some of the other diseases.
Well, I don't know if I can explain why necessarily. The amount of money that is spent on dialysis in the United States today is phenomenal. So the Medicare end-stage renal disease program spends about $30 to $35 billion a year. That's billion with a B, on care for patients with end-stage renal disease. And as you know, unfortunately, the majority of those patients are patients on dialysis, not transplant recipients, because there's just not enough transplant kidneys to go around. That's more money than the entire NIH budget. That's more money than the federal government spends on all biomedical research through the National Institutes of Health combined. That's HIV research, that's cardiovascular research, it's cancer research. And so some of these other diseases, which are very common, don't get me wrong, 500,000 deaths from cardiovascular disease in the United States every year. A scary epidemic of a new virus, HIV, that broke out in the 1980s that had no treatment, get a lot of attention. So there's some $300 some per patient per year spent on HIV research. There's a little less than $100 per patient per year spent on cardiovascular disease research by the National Institutes of Health. Shuvo, you can correct me if I've got these numbers wrong. I think I may be off by an order of magnitude on the HIV number. It may be closer to $3,000 per patient per year for HIV research. And a little over $100 for cardiovascular research, a couple $100 per patient per year for cancer research. Kidney disease research gets a measly $30 a year per patient in the United States. It's astonishing that a disease that costs more than the entire NIH budget to treat gets only $30 per patient per year. It's phenomenal. Now, why that is, I don't know if I could decipher the reasoning for that. I know as a physician, I wear a stethoscope, I see patients for a living in addition to the research, that when you tell a patient you've had a heart attack, that gets their undivided attention. For the rest of the day, they are paying attention to that word that you just said. If you tell a patient, I'm worried this lump is a cancer, that gets their undivided attention. It seizes their fears. When I tell a patient in clinic, your kidneys aren't functioning normally, I'm worried that you're going to get kidney failure, the answer is often, well, there's dialysis for that, right? There's a way in which this disease process, for whatever reason, has not captured the imagination of people who haven't been affected by it. We know that end-stage renal disease treated with dialysis has worse mortality than metastatic colon cancer. If somebody gives you a choice between cancer and renal failure, pick the cancer. It's remarkable how devastating end-stage renal disease is to patients and the extent to which federal research dollars have been devoted to other diseases. Now, I don't want to badmouth the NIH, and I certainly don't want to badmouth the National Institute for Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Diseases, because they have sponsored our research, and they have a deep commitment to deciphering under basic mechanisms of disease and discovery science. And Shuvo and I, Dr. Roy and I, we're not doing science experiments here. This isn't test tubes and theories. This is trying to move proven technologies that have been demonstrated on the bench into the hands of patients to save real patients' lives. And it is a break with the usual NIH model to fund technology development research. They have been committed to discovery science for years with the understanding that the best dialysis is the dialysis that you never have to prescribe because there was an effective treatment for the disease that you had. The National Institute for Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering, NIBIB, under Roderick Pettigrew's leadership, fellow MIT grad, has been inspired to say, look, we need to expand the NIH portfolio to include technology development, to implement technology remedies for existing diseases. So I only have the highest praise for them. But again, you compare a couple $1,000s per patient per year to HIV for HIV research and a measly $30 a year for kidney disease research. I would love to see that portfolio rebalanced to get this very common disease, kidney disease, that's got devastating consequences for patients, funded at a level appropriate for its costs to America's society its cost to the federal government, and the crushing burden that it places on patients that I take care of every day.
So I think that's very good, Bill. I just want to put in perspective why we are where we are, because some of you are familiar with other medical device technologies and how they end up getting developed to products. So typically, if medical device technology gets invented, tested in the lab, goes through animal testing, and then gets a venture capital, at least in the U.S., or becomes part of a corporate partner, and that takes it to the next level. So the question from Rosemary Dixon: would a filter that is tried and tested to definitely work be enough for the project to start receiving corporate funding? Let me take a stab at answering that. So as you've heard, the FDA has said the first key step in showing that the device is safe is the filter is going to work and not cause blood clots. Is that a product in itself? We think it's possible for it to be a product. I am located here in San Francisco, the heart of Silicon Valley, where a lot of medical devices and other kinds of technologies have been funded by the investor community. Talk about Facebook, talk about Google, talk about all these companies that are here. So when I first came out here, I went and talked to a lot of the investor community and said, what do you need to see for this project to receive funding? And a key answer that came back was that you guys are doing very interesting and great work, but you're too early from an investor perspective to invest financial resources in. So you need to take this to large animals, and at that point, you show that it works in large animals, we would be interested in supporting it. So that has defined a key strategy for us. So we are hopeful that once we show this filter working in a large animal for at least 30 days, that's a number we have with the FDA discussions, that will have met a key threshold for the investors. Now, can we guarantee that? We obviously can't, but we have enough discussions and we have enough interest that that's a place we feel we need to target. So when you see the numbers like 250,000, less than $1 million, the key is to help us to get to that point, because this is not going to go beyond. This will not get to the big goal unless we get to this first initial milestone. Now, having said that, some of you are medical device investors or have friends that are medical device industry may also know that in the context of healthcare technology, the areas of it that get investments are biopharmaceuticals, so new drugs. There's healthcare IT, so the systems that analyze data and information. And we've got medical devices. Traditionally, biopharmaceuticals have gotten the most investment dollars because the perception, and rightfully so, was that if you found the right drug, say for cancer or for any particular disease, the payoff was so much that they could recoup their investments. Medical devices were always perceived as the ones that did not pay off in the same big way. But in the past, when they did invest, they paid off because there's already suppliers, there's already a group of corporate partners that would acquire those technologies. But what has happened in the last few years, especially with the Great Recession, is that many of those investors that are familiar with medical devices were just not available to put additional money into new technologies. And that has slowed down the uptake of medical device investment, especially early stage and what is perceived as high risk. So we have that challenge. But so it is, in some ways, our challenge to get to a point so that we can make our the filter attractive to medical device investors. And to that, we look towards grants, we look towards philanthropy, we look towards other creative ways of getting us to that point so we are better positioned to leverage the partners we have on the corporate side. So I'm going to take another question here from Suriel, who says, sounds like, I think after responding to Dr. Fizel, sounds like a good PR or ad agency is needed for public education on CKD. Have you reached out to a big agency for pro bono work? Through UCSF and Vanderbilt, yes, we do reach out, but let me just frame this with many of the other diseases. So we are one disease, and you obviously have an interest in kidney disease, but there are diseases like cancer, HIV, you talk about heart disease, diabetes. Each of them has their own PR campaign. Traditionally, kidney disease has not had that, and it has not had the same sort of emotional trigger to the lay people as these other diseases. So that has been a challenge. We have reached out. We have gotten some work, but would love to figure out ways how the community can help us reach out to groups that can help us in advocating the advances that we are working on, as well as other researchers are working on. So one way you might want to think about is, I've encouraged everybody who talks to me to reach out to their congressman, to congressperson. Reach out to their local newspaper. Make it a human interest story. Because clearly, if you can pull on that trigger, then you will get the attention of people who can broadcast the information or do something about it. And that's something that I think we would have to work together. Certainly UCSF and Vanderbilt are doing that, but we need more. Dr. Fizel and I are but two people. We have lots of support, but we are nothing when you compare our effort to the people that are working on, say, stents for heart disease. When you look at stents, there's hundreds of different groups around the world that are working on new technologies for coronary diseases. For kidney, there's probably not more than a dozen. So should we move to another question, or do you want to add anything to that, Bill? Maybe move on?
I think you're exactly right. I think that when you look back at the project to date that Shuvo and I have worked on, we have had very much an open door policy towards collaborators. There's other fields like cancer research or cardiovascular research where people are very jealous with their projects. They don't let other people in. This is mine. Somebody's going to steal my glory. In our context, there's an awful lot of work to do on understanding mechanisms of kidney disease. There's an awful lot of work to be done to understand how dialysis works to benefit patients and what are the mechanisms by which dialysis patients get into trouble. I mean, we've been dialyzing people for 55 years and we still don't know the molecular identities of the things that make patients on dialysis sick. It's remarkable. So if someone listening now has an idea, has a friend, has a contact, and wants to help, we welcome you with open arms, because we're not jealous, oh, somebody else is going to take our stuff, somebody else is going to, run away with our idea and do something else. There's plenty of work for everybody here. And so, again, we have, over the years, been fantastically rewarded by the enthusiasm of enlightened collaborators. And we could go through a very long list here, whether it be Andrew Zidney at Penn State, Terry Conlisk at Ohio State, David Humes, who took me into a renal fellowship when nobody else would give me the time of day because of this crazy story I was telling about an implantable artificial kidney. We have welcomed people who have come to us with enthusiasm and the willingness to put the shoulder to the wheel and work towards making this project better. And so if you have a contact with an ad agency who's had some understanding of kidney disease and wants to say, look, I'm going to take this on and try to spread the message, please, we welcome you with open arms. There's only two of us here. Somebody else can shoulder part of the burden. Please, we welcome all collaborators.
Thank you. One of the questions that just popped up is, I just saw this about a question about a prize and the answer is, Possibly, right? Because if we spend, like I said, $21 million for an artificial kidney, and the potential payoff in this is savings over tens of billions of dollars to the U.S. economy and obviously much more worldwide. This is a question provided by David Mayer. So how do we do that? The government is hearing about all kinds of needs by the community from different interest groups, different communities. So I completely agree that we need to get more attention to the government and have them play a bigger role, because they are the main payers, at least in the Western world, of kidney disease patients. So there's obviously an incentive that we would think that they would be motivated to address the problem. As you know, sometimes it can be hard to get attention of the government, so we really rely on the grassroots to reach out. Now, I say this, and I think that's great to advocate to the government, and I think the price concept is interesting. Now, there's a downside to the price concept, which is you've got to be able to do the work to get the prize. So if there is a big prize, maybe the investors would step up to date. But when it's the example of let's develop a kidney and it's going to take me 10, 15 years before the Medicare decides they will pay for it, the investors are thinking, geez, maybe I should just invest in a new drug that if I show some efficacy, I can get them to pay for it within 2 or 3 years. You'll hear these blockbuster drugs about cancer occasionally or diabetes that get a lot of attention because the investors see that if they can get to a key study, then not only the government but insurance companies will pay. Interestingly, in this country, most insurance companies, private insurance companies, don't actually pay for kidney failure patients. It tends to be the government. So we as a community, and especially the patient community and their friends and family, have, I think, an opportunity to help us take the message to the folks in government and encourage them to be creative, whether it's a prize, whether it's saying, look, let's set aside some money for kidney disease research, which costs the U.S. Medicare budget the single largest component in their overall budget for healthcare from Medicare. So to give you some numbers, Medicare spends about $35 billion for ESRD, and that is about 7% of its budget. No other disease has that kind of hit. NIH, the institute that takes care of all the research, gets about $32 billion a year. So that's what I think the community on the research side has to deal with. But we, on the technology side, have to get to a point where we can attract investors who will come in and say, look, I will be willing to take this risk, and if the government steps up, it will make it that much easier for the investors to come to step up to the plate.
So this is Bill. There's another subtlety to this. I want to echo what Shivo said about the prize concept. I think the prize concept is interesting, and it's got the ability to create buzz, create talk. But again, if we had the resources to get to winning a prize, then we wouldn't need the prize. We'd be done. So any prize competition in this area for any medical device, I think, has to have some sort of a staged and milestone-driven component to reward incremental progress. Because, you know, as it is now, with a $60 billion total available market, somebody who gets a paradigm-shifting technology into the marketplace, any dollar prize kitty is probably going to be a relatively small number compared to the commercial advantage. Now, the other thing about one of the possible explanations for innovation stagnation in this area is end-stage renal disease is unique in that not only is it the only disease-specific Medicare entitlement in the United States, so since 1971, patients with end-stage renal disease are cared for, have their care paid for by Medicare after some period of time where their private insurance that they have, it covers the cost of illness. The other thing is that that's severely capitated care. There's a composite reimbursement rate that Medicare pays the dialysis unit for providing care. So when investors are thinking about coming up with a new mousetrap to treat something, when investors are thinking about a new and disruptive technology that could take over a market, do they want to focus on a market where the sky's the limit, like some cancer drug that might cost $360,000 a year per patient, and since they're the only people with the cure, they can set the price wherever they want? Or do they want to focus on a market where the reimbursement is capitated by Medicare and there's an upper limit to what they could make in any environment? So I think the reimbursement structure also has served in the past to discourage innovation in this field, because, you know, why should I invest in something that's uncertain, because this is research, where there's an absolute ceiling on the amount of money that I could ever make off of doing this? For Shuvo, for me, the lives of our patients is the payout. The fact that I see sick people every day who are desperate for an alternative to what's available to them, that's what gets me up in the morning and has me come to work and work on this project. That's the mission that's inspired our collaborators. It's not some desire to get rich. We could get rich in a million different ways if we tried. We could have already licensed the technology to some company that could have put it on the shelf, and we could be perfectly financially comfortable. That's not why we're here. But the role of the payers in end-stage renal disease, I think, plays a role in the excitement that investors might or might not have to dive in at an earlier, riskier stage. Shuva, I don't know if you want to add to that or not.
All right. So, Bill, no, that was excellent. Thank you. I know we are running a little bit short on time, but I wanted to give a shout out to Ken Sharp, who we know, and he asked a question through Irene, whether a person with no kidneys would be a candidate, no kidney function would be a candidate for the bioartificial kidney. And then also a question from Stephanie that says, how do you get on the clinical trials wait list? So I think, Ken, so first of all, thanks for listening in. And the answer is the device, as we envision it, should be applicable to patients that don't have functioning kidneys. So there's nothing that says that just because you don't have kidney function, you'd not be eligible for this. In terms of how we get on the clinical trials waiting list, let me first of all say that we don't actually have a trials waiting list. We have an interest list that the Kidney Project, keeps on record, and for that you can go through our project coordinator, Stephanie Brummett, that many of you know, and she's keeping everybody's information on record. So when the timing is right, we'll actually get in touch with the people who are on that list. In terms of the patients that will be selected for the initial clinical trials, I'll let actually Bill talk a little bit about the thinking that has gone into the first set of patients that we might test our device on.
So again, I want to make sure, so just for a little cultural awareness, I think part of that question about whether this implantable artificial kidney would be appropriate for patients with no kidney function. Many of you know that patients who choose peritoneal dialysis as their modality, where they do self-care dialysis at home, not through hemodialysis, but through peritoneal dialysis, those patients are often dependent on some residual kidney function, on some level of function of their original kidneys for that therapy to be effective for them. And that may be where that question came from. We anticipate with our design that a patient who's got no kidney function, so for example, a patient who had a kidney cancer and had their kidney cut out, would be perfectly eligible to receive a device like this and would be able to enjoy all the potential benefits of the device. So I just wanted to add that that may be part of where that question came from. You know, it's a delicate matter to decide who's going to be the guinea pig, who's going to be the first one. And while we are absolutely appreciative of the enthusiasm that all of you bring and the altruism that is expressed by every one of you, where I have heard countless times, I don't care about the risk to me. If I can make things better for the next patient, it doesn't matter if I get hurt in the process. You know, I have the utmost respect for the altruism and the selflessness of patients who are volunteering already now, before they even know anything more about the device than the idea, to participate. The first biggest risk that we have to get past as physicians, and the desire to do no harm, is the risk of the surgery. Today, if you go to the hospital and you need a hip surgery, you need a vascular surgery, the first thing that we do as physicians is ask ourselves, can your heart survive the surgery? We do a so-called preoperative risk stratification for your heart. We often do a preoperative risk stratification for your lungs. If, for example, you've been a smoker, or if you've had a work-related lung injury, like silicosis or pneumoconiosis, or you've got a heritable lung disease, we need to know about that before you undergo anesthesia. The surgery that we're projecting will be necessary is about the same level of cardiovascular stress as a kidney transplant. The patient's going to get opened up, and big blood vessels are going to be clamped and unclamped. So patients will need to have some form of preoperative risk stratification in hand before they can be eligible. And so that steers us automatically towards patients who have been on the kidney transplant wait list. If you've been listed for a kidney transplant, then you will have had your preoperative risk stratification completed, because they need to know that you're ready to go to the operating room at a moment's notice to receive a kidney. At the same time, if we look at that patient population, we've already identified a group of patients who definitely want to do something else besides dialysis because they've gotten themselves through the recipient evaluation process for a kidney transplant. They've shown the motivation to do that and the ability to do that. And they've been evaluated and they're healthy enough that a surgery is low risk. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing is that we don't want to interfere with the transplant. So what happens if you're on day 3 of our study with our device sewn in you and you get that phone call that says, you're at the top of the list and we have a kidney of your blood type available, do you want the transplant? Well, you'd be pretty silly to say no, right? Because transplant's the best possible treatment that there is for end-stage renal disease today that we know of. So we also want to choose a patient population who's listed for transplant but may have trouble getting one. So, for example, I know we had an inquiry from someone who said that they'd had a couple of transplants, and because of their prior sensitization, they're unlikely to get another one as much as they might want one. So we're looking at that group of patients who are highly sensitized and are really unlikely to get a transplant, let alone a second or a third or a fourth transplant, as one of the groups that we're going to look at to be the vanguard, to be the people who are really at the cutting edge, where we feel that we can safely do a surgery and get the device in the patient and get the device back out of the patient without causing harm to them. Because the last thing any of us want is a disaster. We don't want to hurt a patient, and we don't want to be under undue scrutiny from regulatory agencies in our first couple of patients. Obviously, with any medical device, with any experimental device, in a high-risk population of patients with end-stage renal disease, we have 16% per year mortality anyway, right? Some patients in the course of our studies are going to have bad outcomes because of the incredible morbidity and mortality that end-stage renal disease presents to everyone. What we don't want to do is accidentally accelerate that process by subjecting a patient to the stress of a surgery. And when we talked to the Food and Drug Administration, they brought out everybody. People from their experimental laboratories, from their basic research laboratories, engineers, and they brought out medical doctors, and they brought out transplant surgeons to talk to us about patient selection. So on the day of our very first meeting with the FDA, Shuvo remembers this, we had a surgeon in the room, an FDA employee, who was talking to us about patient selection for clinical trials. So it's a delicate process. I think we want to maintain a list of everybody who's interested, because we don't want anybody to be excluded or to feel excluded, but we want to step very, very carefully and not accidentally hurt somebody in our eagerness to get this device out to patients.
Thank you, Bill. And at this time, I should say we've gone a little over, but that's okay. I want to take a moment to thank all of you for participating in this hangout. It's the first time for us doing this, and if this is something that's interesting and helpful for you, we'll definitely do it again. There's some questions we're not able to answer. We'll answer that through Facebook or maybe a future session. And this session will be available through the YouTube, and we'll take extracts of some of these questions you have provided us and expand on them through our weekly Q&A. So again, we are really appreciative of your enthusiasm, of your support, and your willingness to work with us, because that's what I think of you, your partners, to move this device forward into clinical trials. Thank you.
Thank you.